The walls of the gallery were lined with paintings from some of the most celebrated artists of the time. Sculptures, glass art, and stunning photographs filled every corner of the upscale space, each piece more expensive than the last. The gallery owner, Jonathan Rowe, was the epitome of success, a man who knew exactly how to market art to the right buyers. He had spent years building his empire, knowing how to identify the artists whose works would sell for millions, and how to turn emerging talent into household names. Jonathan had long since stopped worrying about the opinions of others. His judgment was impeccable. He didn't need to ask anyone's advice on a painting's worth, he could tell by instinct. He was the man in charge. His gallery, Rowe Fine Arts, was renowned throughout the city, frequented by wealthy collectors and powerful patrons of the arts. His clients trusted his opinion, and his prices reflected his expertise. As far as Jonathan was concerned, he had the art world in his grasp. One afternoon, a quiet knock on the gallery's door interrupted Jonathan's thoughts. He looked up from his desk, mildly annoyed at the interruption. It was a slight disruption to his day, but as the door swung open, he quickly forced a smile, putting his professional mask back on. The man who entered the gallery was nothing like the usual high-profile clients Jonathan was accustomed to. He was dressed simply, with a rugged jacket and worn jeans, and his features were sharp, yet his eyes revealed an unsettling calm. He carried a large canvas wrapped in plain brown paper, tucked under his arm with the casual grace of someone who didn't care for the finer details of presentation. Jonathan, ever the businessman, immediately took stock of the man's attire and demeanor and quickly surmised that he wasn't a serious buyer. Maybe an aspiring artist looking for advice, or someone hoping to sell something of little value. "Well, good afternoon," Jonathan greeted, his tone polite but clipped. "How can I help you today?" "I've got something I'd like you to see," the man replied. "A painting I've been working on. It's different, but I think it's worth showing." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, but gestured for the man to proceed. "Let's see it then," he said with a forced smile, his thoughts already elsewhere, planning his next meeting with an art collector who was interested in a much more prestigious piece. The man unwrapped the canvas with care, revealing a striking piece of art. It was a series of abstract patterns, some seemingly random, others appearing like they might be part of a deeper story. The colors were bold, vibrant reds, deep blues, and flickers of yellow, arranged in a way that felt almost chaotic, yet somehow beautiful. There was an energy to the piece, a movement, as though it were alive. Jonathan blinked, his mind struggling to process the unorthodox design. He quickly suppressed his confusion, a practiced move, as he examined the piece more closely, now outwardly assessing it. "Interesting," he said after a moment, his tone more dismissive than appreciative. "But, well, I think you'll find the market is a little more particular when it comes to these kinds of works. This kind of abstract style, it's a bit simplistic. It lacks sophistication, and I'm afraid it doesn't really stand out in the way some of the bigger pieces do. It's too raw, too unfinished." The man stood silently, staring at Jonathan as he spoke. Jonathan, confident in his expertise, continued, "You see, collectors are looking for art that tells a deeper story. Something with refined technique. This," he gestured to the painting with a wave of his hand, "this won't do in a gallery like mine." The artist, whose name was James, felt a sting of humiliation. He had expected some form of criticism, after all, the world of art was a tough one. But Jonathan's words, cold and dismissive, hit harder than he had anticipated. The gallery owner had seen so many paintings in his career that he couldn't even recognize genius when it was staring him in the face. James had spent years honing his craft, painting from a place deep within his soul. He poured his experiences, his pain, his joys, and his truths into every brushstroke. He had made quiet deals over the years, selling similar paintings for millions to private buyers who recognized the brilliance of his work. But he had never cared for the spotlight. He was not the type of artist who craved attention or fame. He simply wanted his work to be appreciated, even if it meant staying out of the limelight. However, what hurt most was how Jonathan treated his art as if it were nothing more than the work of an amateur. James kept his composure, not revealing the extent of his inner turmoil. He knew that showing anger would get him nowhere. He had long learned to hide his feelings behind a calm exterior, never allowing anyone to see just how much it pained him when his work was dismissed. And yet, there was something about the way Jonathan spoke that made James feel small, like he was nothing more than a passing phase in the art world. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, confident that the conversation was over. "I appreciate you bringing this by, but honestly, I can't offer you anything. You should probably find a smaller gallery, or someone who's willing to take a risk on unrefined pieces like this. But it won't get far in my world." The artist nodded silently, his eyes never leaving the painting. He couldn't bear to argue, not when he knew he would just be met with the same dismissive attitude. He felt the weight of his frustration building up, but quickly reined it in. He wasn't here to prove anything to Jonathan. He had already proven his worth, quietly, without fanfare. "I understand," James said quietly. "Thank you for your time." He turned to leave the gallery, but as he reached the door, Jonathan's voice called out to him one last time. "By the way," Jonathan said, his voice casual, "you should really consider taking a different direction with your art. Maybe something with more complexity. You'll need that if you want to make it big. But trust me, you'll never get a gallery showing with that kind of work." James closed the door behind him without looking back, his heart heavy with disappointment. As he stepped out into the cold air of the city, he couldn't help but smile to himself, knowing that one day, Jonathan's opinion wouldn't matter. He was a millionaire, and one day, this gallery owner would realize that the art he had rejected was worth far more than he could ever imagine. What Jonathan didn't know was that James was already well beyond the point of needing his approval. The crisp air of December bit at James as he stood by his window, staring out at the shimmering skyline of the city. The coldness seemed to penetrate deeper than the layers of fabric surrounding his body, as though it were creeping inside him, filling the emptiness he felt in his chest. The city glittered with holiday lights, and the festive cheer was inescapable. The air hummed with the sound of celebrations, the laughter of families, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of holiday shopping bags. But none of it reached James. Not this year. As a millionaire, his life was a collection of private jets, extravagant mansions, and grandiose celebrations. For years, he had surrounded himself with a circle of high-profile friends, business partners, and acquaintances, attending lavish parties, attending gala after gala, drinking champagne in ballrooms that sparkled with chandeliers and gold. He had bought joy, or so he thought, in the form of material wealth and a constant flow of people. But no matter how many guests, how much laughter, how many expensive gifts surrounded him, the loneliness was always there, lurking beneath the surface, haunting him during quiet moments when the world outside fell away. Christmas had become the symbol of this void. For the last several years, he had attended the same festive gatherings, surrounded by people who smiled politely at him, but none of them truly knew him. None of them understood the ache that came with being surrounded by emptiness, not because there was a lack of people, but because the people who filled his life were there for the wrong reasons. They wanted to be close to the wealth, the connections, the image of a man who had everything. But no one cared about James the person. No one asked how he was doing, what he needed, what he truly longed for. The thought of attending another grand celebration, another empty event filled with hollow conversations, was unbearable. As the holiday approached, James began to dread the thought of another Christmas alone in a crowded room full of people who didn't see him as anything more than a means to an end. Anything more than a means to an end. And so, for the first time in years, he made the decision to forego the extravagant gatherings. This Christmas would be different. He didn't need the flashy cars, the expensive suits, the wealth. What he craved, what he had longed for in his soul, was connection. Genuine connection. And there was only one place he could think to find it. He decided, after a long pause of contemplation, that he would spend Christmas somewhere he had never thought of before, somewhere simple, humble, and filled with warmth. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and made his way out of his penthouse apartment, the sounds of the city buzzing around him as he walked into the cold streets. He had a destination in mind, the modest house of his longtime maid, Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson had worked for him for over a decade. She was a woman in her late 50s, gentle and strong, with a warmth that contrasted with the cold professionalism he often surrounded himself with. For all the money he had amassed, she had never treated him like a wealthy patron, nor had she ever taken him for granted. She saw him not as an artist or a millionaire, but as a human being, a person in need of care and understanding, just like anyone else. It was something he had only come to appreciate over time, especially after years of being surrounded by people who only wanted something from him. Her house was in a quiet neighborhood, tucked away on a small street lined with modest homes. Nothing about the area screamed luxury, but that was part of the allure. It was a place that felt real, authentic in a way that the other corners of his life never had been. The lights on the houses were simple, but there was something beautiful in their simplicity. The warmth that emanated from the little houses was the kind of comfort he had missed, and it felt like a small act of rebellion to turn his back on the flashy extravagance he was used to. As he arrived at her door, he hesitated for just a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. He wasn't sure what to expect. This wasn't just a visit, it was an attempt to reconnect with something deeper within himself, something he hadn't realized he had been missing for years. Mrs. Thompson answered the door with a smile, as always. Her kind eyes were warm with recognition, but there was also a hint of surprise, as though she hadn't expected him to show up on Christmas Eve, of all times. "James? What are you doing here?" she exclaimed, stepping aside to let him in. Her voice was filled with surprise, but it quickly melted into a tone of tenderness. She had always treated him with care, never judging, never assuming. It was as if she had always known that his world was far more complicated than anyone could see. I just wanted to spend Christmas with you," he said, the words coming out with a vulnerability he wasn't used to expressing. "I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want to be alone." Her face softened, and without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug, surprising him with her genuine affection. "Well, you're never alone here, James," she said gently, leading him into the living room. "Come in. Your family always have been." The warmth of the room hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the coldness of the city outside. The smell of freshly baked bread and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of pine from a small Christmas tree in the corner. It wasn't extravagant by any means, just a simple, modest tree adorned with handmade decorations and a few twinkling lights. The house was cozy, the kind of place where people could truly feel at home, where laughter and conversation flowed freely. Mrs. Thompson guided James to the couch, her movements unhurried but filled with the kind of thoughtfulness that spoke volumes. She didn't ask him what had been wrong or why he had shown up, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was there, and she was ready to provide whatever comfort he needed. Dinner was simple but delicious, a hearty meal of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and homemade apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, but it was never forced. They talked about old times, about things that made James smile, about memories from his childhood, and about the things that truly mattered. Mrs. Thompson never asked about his wealth or his status as an artist. She didn't need to. She knew him as the person who had walked into her life years ago and had simply been someone in need of kindness. And she offered him that kindness unconditionally. As they sat by the fire after dinner, sipping hot cocoa, James felt something shift within him. The coldness that had gripped him earlier in the evening began to melt away. It wasn't the luxury of his penthouse that made him feel whole, it wasn't the expensive parties or the latest collection of paintings. It was this, the simplicity of a humble home, the genuine affection of someone who cared for him without any pretense. The warmth of a real connection, untainted by the artificiality of wealth. "I don't know why I've been running from this," he admitted quietly, staring into the fire. "I've spent so many years trying to buy happiness, trying to surround myself with people who never really cared. But this feels right. You've always treated me like family." Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes twinkling as she gazed at him. "That's because you are family, James. you just had to realize it. The hours passed in the comfort of each other's presence, and by the time Christmas morning arrived, James had experienced something he hadn't known he was missing. The coldness in his heart had been replaced with warmth, and the loneliness that had haunted him for so long had finally begun to fade. Here, in Mrs. Thompson's simple, modest home, he had found the one thing he hadn't realized he had been. The evening settled into a peaceful rhythm in Mrs. Thompson's cozy living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm, amber glow across the room. The smell of the freshly baked apple pie still lingered in the air, and the faint clink of spoons against mugs punctuated the comfortable silence between the artist and his maid. There was something serene about this moment, something genuine that James had not felt in a long time. His eyes were no longer distant, no longer wandering. Instead, they were focused, watching the fire as it danced, mesmerized by the simplicity of it all. Mrs. Thompson sat across from him, her presence calm and steady, as always. She had made him feel at home in a way no one had ever managed to before. He had spent years building an empire of wealth, but nothing he had created could match the peace he felt in her quiet company. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't expected to be anyone or anything other than himself. The pressures of the art world, the expectations of his social circle, the weight of his millionaire status, it all seemed to evaporate in the warmth of this small, humble house. As they sat together, a silence settled over them. It was a comfortable kind of quiet, the kind that invited reflection and connection. James stirred his cocoa, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic mug. He glanced up at Mrs. Thompson, watching her for a moment, unsure how to begin the conversation that had been building in his mind all evening. He hadn't expected to talk so deeply tonight, but the comfort of her presence was enough to make him want to open up, to share the burdens he had carried in silence for so long. Mrs. Thompson noticed the shift in his demeanor. She had known him long enough to recognize when something was troubling him, even when he didn't speak it aloud. Her eyes softened as she set her own mug aside and leaned in slightly, her voice gentle. "You've been quiet tonight, James," she said, her tone filled with understanding. "Is something weighing on you?" James hesitated. He had spent so much of his life avoiding this kind of conversation, talking about feelings, about struggles. He had never wanted to appear weak, never wanted to admit that he wasn't the untouchable millionaire that everyone believed him to be. But here, with Mrs. Thompson, it felt different. She didn't expect him to have all the answers. She didn't see him as a person to be admired for his wealth, but simply as someone she had cared for over the years. The walls he had built around himself started to crumble, piece by piece. "I guess I've just been thinking about everything," he said slowly, his voice quiet. "The last few years have been lonely. I'm always surrounded by people who want something from me. Whether it's my money, my connections, or my art. But none of them really see me, not for who I am. And every Christmas, it's the same. I throw these big parties, I buy extravagant gifts, but none of it fills the hole inside of me. I've spent so much time trying to impress people, trying to be someone I thought I had to be. But when I'm alone, it's like I can't escape the emptiness." His words hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded. He had never admitted this kind of vulnerability to anyone, not to his friends, not to his associates, and certainly not to the people in his life who constantly treated him like a commodity. But here, in Mrs. Thompson's presence, it felt like he could finally breathe, like he didn't have to put on a mask to hide his true feelings. Mrs. Thompson didn't speak right away. She simply nodded, her expression thoughtful. Then, in her usual steady, comforting manner, she leaned forward, folding her hands on her lap. She didn't offer quick fixes or empty reassurances. Instead, she spoke with the kind of wisdom that only comes from a life lived with intention and simplicity. "You know, James," she said softly, her voice laced with a quiet strength, "you're not the first person to feel that way. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that money and success will solve everything. But what you're describing, that's the difference between being surrounded by people and being truly seen." James looked at her, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. He had spent years chasing success, but had never considered that true fulfillment might come from something entirely different. People who love you for who you are, James, not for what you can give them, that's what really matters. Relationships. Connections. It's the simple things that make life worth living. The laughter over a cup of tea. The comfort of a familiar face when you need it. You can have all the money in the world, but if you don't have anyone to share it with, what's the point? James absorbed her words in silence, allowing them to sink into the depth of his heart. The weight he had carried for so long began to lighten, and for the first time in years, he felt like the person he was on the inside was starting to match the person he showed the world. He sighed softly, his eyes casting downward as the firelight danced across the walls. I've been so focused on building my empire, I never thought about what I was really building it for. I thought money would give me purpose, but it's just a shell. The emptiness is always there. Even when the parties are full, even when the paintings are sold for millions, it's still there. And I'm tired of pretending it's not. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her expression kind. That's the first step, James. Admitting that something isn't right. You've been chasing something outside of yourself for so long, you've forgotten what truly fills you up. It's not the money. It's the people you let into your life. The ones who care about you, not for what you have, but for who you are. That's where the real value lies. James nodded slowly, his chest tightening with the realization that for all his wealth, he had missed out on something far more precious. In his quest for external validation, he had neglected the internal connections that truly mattered, the bonds of friendship, loyalty, and love. Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice steady and filled with gentle wisdom. You've done a lot of good with your art, James. People admire your work, yes. But at the end of the day, the people who matter most are the ones who don't care about your paintings or your money. They care about you. And when you start living with that truth, you'll find your way. The room grew quieter as James sat back, taking in her words. The weight of his loneliness had always been hidden beneath layers of success, but now, in the stillness of Mrs. Thompson's living room, he could finally face it. The artist he had become was not the person he had always hoped to be. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of change within himself. Mrs. Thompson's words, simple yet profound, had begun to open something inside him. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. He realized that he had been looking for happiness in the wrong places. His wealth and fame had brought him admiration, but not love. Not true connection. What he had found here, in this small home, with this kind and humble woman, was what he had been seeking all along: authenticity, warmth, and a bond that had nothing to do with his status or his bank account. The fire crackled softly as the night grew deeper, and James realized that something had shifted within him. The loneliness he had known for so long no longer felt as all-encompassing. He had found a new path, one that wasn't about accumulating wealth, but about fostering connections, real and true, with those who saw him for who he truly was. And in that moment, as he sat by the fire with Mrs. Thompson, laughing and sharing stories, he understood, the value of life wasn't in the things you owned, but in the people you loved, and in the people who loved you back. Jonathan Rowe stood in front of the large, mirrored glass windows of his gallery, surveying the bustling preparations for the grand reopening of Rowe Fine Arts. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the edge of his polished mahogany desk, his mind moving quickly from one task to the next as he reviewed the guest list, the catered menu, and the last-minute arrangements for the evening's gala. His gallery had been a staple of high society for years, and he was determined that this reopening would surpass all expectations. It wasn't just a reopening, it was a statement. He would show the art world that Rowe Fine Arts was the place to be, the place where only the finest, most sought-after pieces would be displayed. Jonathan's reputation in the art world was as polished as his gallery's floors. He had long ago perfected the art of curating collections that fetched astronomical prices, and his name alone could make an artist's career. But despite his success, something had started to gnaw at him recently. He had started to wonder whether his judgment was as flawless as he'd once believed it to be. It had been nearly a year since the day he had rejected the work of the black artist James. At the time, Jonathan had been certain he had made the right choice. The artist's work was too raw, too simple. He had dismissed it as a passing trend, unworthy of the space in his gallery. Yet, there was something about the memory of that particular encounter that lingered in Jonathan's mind. He couldn't quite explain it, but it seemed as though, deep down, he had misjudged something important. He was jolted from his thoughts by the sound of his assistant's voice. "Mr. Rowe, there's an unexpected offer I need to show you," she said, entering the room with a large envelope in hand. Her eyes were wide with curiosity, but there was also an undercurrent of professionalism. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, taking the envelope from her and carefully peeling it open. Inside was a letter, and as he read, his eyes widened in disbelief. The letter contained a proposal from an anonymous buyer, someone willing to purchase an entire collection of James's paintings. The offer was substantial. More than substantial, this buyer was offering millions. Jonathan's initial shock gave way to disbelief. James? The very same artist he had mocked so harshly and dismissed as a failure? The paintings he had labeled too simplistic, too lacking in sophistication? And now, someone with millions to spend, was ready to acquire the entire collection. He read the letter again, slowly this time, wondering how he could have been so wrong. His mind raced. Had he made a mistake? Was James's work actually worth more than he had realized? He thought back to their encounter. The way he had dismissed the artist with arrogance, not even taking the time to understand the true depth of the work. His confidence had been a mask, hiding the truth that he had missed something extraordinary. Jonathan had never been so certain of his misjudgment before, and now he could only wonder whether the artist was already living in the heights of success he had rejected. Jonathan folded the letter, staring at it in silence for a moment. He had a sudden, overwhelming urge to meet this mysterious buyer, to understand what they saw in James's work that he had failed to see. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the sting of his earlier arrogance reminding him that he had once been blind to the value of the artist's pieces. As the day of the reopening approached, Jonathan found himself haunted by the memory of the rejection. The opening night would still go on, of course, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing, something that could change the trajectory of his gallery's future. Could this anonymous buyer be a way to redeem his error? Or had he lost his chance entirely? Meanwhile, James, fully aware of the offer being made to the gallery owner, had undergone a profound transformation in the months since their last encounter. The quiet holiday he had spent with Mrs. Thompson had shifted something inside him, a realization that he was no longer willing to hide behind a veil of anonymity. For too long, he had kept his true identity concealed, uncertain of the world's reaction to his wealth and success. But now, he had embraced who he truly was, a man who was both an artist and a millionaire, not for the sake of fame, but because his work had genuine value. His paintings were not just random strokes of paint, they were an extension of himself, of his life, of his soul. James decided that it was time for him to step into the world he had avoided for so long. He wasn't going to let the gallery owner's mockery define him any longer. The reopening of Rowe Fine Arts would be the perfect opportunity to see how Jonathan truly felt about his work, now that he understood its value. He would attend the event, but this time, he would do so in disguise. He would remain anonymous, hidden behind a new persona, curious to see how Jonathan would react to the very paintings he had once rejected. As the night of the reopening arrived, the gallery was filled with the usual glittering crowd of art enthusiasts, socialites, and wealthy collectors. The champagne flowed freely, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Jonathan had spared no expense in the preparation, and the walls of Rowe Fine Arts gleamed under the soft, warm light, showcasing a carefully curated collection of works, some by well-known artists, others by emerging talent. The pieces were stunning, but Jonathan could feel the weight of his earlier thoughts pressing against him as he glanced toward the corner of the gallery where James's paintings were displayed. The anonymous buyer had insisted that his works be included in the collection, and now, the same paintings Jonathan had once mocked were hanging proudly on the walls. He walked toward the corner of the gallery where the collection was showcased. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, as he stared at the paintings, one after another. The bold swaths of color, the abstract forms, the unrefined beauty of it all, it was undeniable. Each piece seemed to pulse with life, telling stories that he could not have predicted. There was an energy in the work, a raw authenticity that gripped him in a way he couldn't explain. Jonathan stared at the paintings, his mind racing. He was astounded. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind to the depth and power of these pieces? The color choices, the emotion, the energy, they weren't simplistic. They were brilliant. He could see now that James had created something truly valuable, something that would define his legacy in the art world. He couldn't fathom how he had once thought these pieces lacked sophistication. There was a level of genius here that only a true artist could recognize. But what struck Jonathan the most was the absence of James. The artist was nowhere to be found. He had assumed that the anonymous millionaire behind the collection was simply a high-profile collector, someone who had bought these works out of their own appreciation for art. But now, as he stared at the paintings, he couldn't help but wonder if the artist was in the room. As the evening wore on, Jonathan continued to move through the gallery, interacting with guests and mingling with potential buyers. He couldn't stop thinking about the works on the wall, each one seeming to haunt him, reminding him of the mistake he had made. His mind kept drifting back to James, the artist he had so carelessly dismissed. He had no idea that James was standing just a few feet away, watching him with quiet amusement. Disguised in a simple suit and sunglasses, his face obscured by a dark hat, James had blended seamlessly into the crowd. He stood near the back of the gallery, a few feet away from the paintings he had created. He watched as Jonathan moved through the space, his gaze lingering on the pieces he had once dismissed. There was a certain satisfaction in seeing the gallery owner's reaction, but there was also a part of him that felt a twinge of sorrow for Jonathan, sorrow for a man who could not yet recognize the value of authenticity and humility. James didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. He had come to understand that the true value of his work was not in how others perceived it, but in what it meant to him. And now, as he stood quietly in the gallery, watching Jonathan's stunned expression, he realized that this moment was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about something deeper, a recognition of the power of art, of the authenticity that lay beneath every brushstroke, and of the connections that were being forged in this very room. Jonathan paused before one of the paintings, his eyes lingering on it. He didn't notice the man standing nearby, his gaze filled with quiet satisfaction. What he didn't know was that the very artist who had created the masterpiece before him was standing only a few feet away, watching him come to terms with his own mistake. The night wore on, and the gallery remained filled with the hum of conversation and the soft clink of glasses. But Jonathan's thoughts never strayed far from the paintings, and the realization that he had just witnessed the rebirth of an artist he had once so thoroughly underestimated. The evening after the reopening of Rowe Fine Arts was a blur of elegance and quiet regret for Jonathan Rowe. He had spent most of the night circling the room, nodding politely to guests and discussing the pieces with buyers, but his mind kept drifting back to one central thought: how had he been so blind? The paintings by James, the black artist he had dismissed so carelessly months ago, had left him in awe. As he reflected on the collection, he realized that the works he had mocked were masterpieces, bold, unique, and brimming with life. His earlier rejection seemed so utterly foolish now. But what struck Jonathan most was the crushing realization that the artist he had so arrogantly dismissed had been someone far more important than he had known. He hadn't just dismissed an emerging artist, he had mocked a millionaire, a person whose wealth came not from luck or inheritance, but from genuine skill and vision. James wasn't just an unknown figure he could push aside. He was a force in the art world, a man who had quietly built his own success without needing to shout about it, and Jonathan had never once considered that the artist could be sitting among the crowd of his gala guests. Jonathan had tried to approach the paintings with an open mind that night, hoping to learn something from the art he had once derided, but no matter how hard he tried, his mistakes continued to haunt him. He could almost feel the weight of his arrogance pressing down on him. As the last guest left, he found himself standing in the empty gallery, the quiet hum of the night filling the space. The paintings of James hung on the walls, each one speaking of beauty and truth. But the truth was, Jonathan had failed to recognize it until it was too late. The next morning, Jonathan awoke to a sense of deep unease. The guilt gnawed at him, and he knew that he had to make things right. He had to apologize to the artist. But how could he even begin? He didn't know who James was or where to find him. All he could do was try to make amends for the mistake he had made, and hope that somewhere out there, the artist would hear his apology. Meanwhile, James had been watching the events unfold from a quiet distance. He had attended the gallery opening in disguise, quietly observing Jonathan's reaction to the paintings he had once been rejected for. When he saw the gallery owner's stunned expression, the moment felt almost surreal. It was a strange satisfaction to watch Jonathan come to terms with his mistake, but it wasn't about proving a point. It was simply a recognition of his own worth, a moment of clarity that would set him free from the insecurities that had haunted him for so long. James had already made peace with his past, the loneliness, the rejection, the mistakes, but he now understood that true peace came from humility and understanding, not from seeking revenge or bitterness. He had spent too much of his life hiding behind the mask of anonymity. Now, with his success evident, he could let go of the weight of self-doubt and embrace his true identity as both an artist and a person who deserved to be seen for who he was. It was Christmas Day when James finally made his way back to Mrs. Thompson's house. The quiet comfort of her home, the warmth of the family she had welcomed him into, was where he knew he belonged. He had spent so many years trying to fill the void with wealth and status, but now he realized that it was not the grand gestures of fame or fortune that mattered. It was the quiet moments, the shared laughter, the love that people had for each other without the need for anything in return. As he arrived at Mrs. Thompson's house, the scent of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts filled the air. The table was set, the house glowing with the soft light of candles and the crackle of a fire in the hearth. Mrs. Thompson greeted him with a warm hug, her eyes filled with happiness at seeing him again. "I'm so glad you're here, James," she said, her voice filled with a gentle warmth. "We've been waiting for you." James smiled, feeling the weight of his journey slip away with each step he took into her home. This, he realized, was where he belonged. Not in the crowded halls of galleries, not in the spotlight of wealth, but in the quiet embrace of a family who cared for him because they saw him as he was, no pretense, no judgment, just love. They sat down together at the table, the laughter and chatter of Mrs. Thompson's children filling the room as they exchanged stories and shared their holiday meal. For the first time in years, James felt completely at ease. There was no need to impress, no need to be anything other than himself. The presence of family, of real connection, was enough to fill him up in ways he never thought possible. As the evening wore on, James found himself reflecting on the lessons of the past few months. He had learned the importance of humility, not just in others, but in himself. He had learned that love and connection were the true treasures of life, far more valuable than any fortune. And most importantly, he had learned that it was okay to let go of the weight of his past, of the loneliness and the fear of rejection, and embrace the joy that came with being surrounded by those who truly cared for him. Mrs. Thompson's house. The quiet comfort of her home, the warmth of the family she had welcomed him into, was where he knew he belonged. He had spent so many years trying to fill the void with wealth and status, but now he realized that it was not the grand gestures of fame or fortune that mattered. It was the quiet moments, the shared laughter, the love that people had for each other without the need for anything in return. As he arrived at Mrs. Thompson's house, the scent of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts filled the air. The table was set, the house glowing with the soft light of candles and the crackle of a fire in the hearth. Mrs. Thompson greeted him with a warm hug, her eyes filled with happiness at seeing him again. "I'm so glad you're here, James," she said, her voice filled with a gentle warmth. "We've been waiting for you." James smiled, feeling the weight of his journey slip away with each step he took into her home. This, he realized, was where he belonged. Not in the crowded halls of galleries, not in the spotlight of wealth, but in the quiet embrace of a family who cared for him because they saw him as he was, no pretense, no judgment, just love. They sat down together at the table, the laughter and chatter of Mrs. Thompson's children filling the room as they exchanged stories and shared their holiday meal. For the first time in years, James felt completely at ease. There was no need to impress, no need to be anything other than himself. The presence of family, of real connection, was enough to fill him up in ways he never thought possible. As the evening wore on, James found himself reflecting on the lessons of the past few months. He had learned the importance of humility, not just in others, but in himself. He had learned that love and connection were the true treasures of life, far more valuable than any fortune. And most importantly, he had learned that it was okay to let go of the weight of his past, of the loneliness and the fear of rejection, and embrace the joy that came with being surrounded by those who truly cared for him. Mrs. Thompson, ever the wise woman, caught his eye as they cleaned up the table. She smiled knowingly, her gaze soft. "You found something important, haven't you, James?" He nodded, his heart full. "Yes, I have. I used to think that success was about what I could achieve alone, about what I could buy, or what I could prove. But now I know that success is about the people we share our lives with. The love we give and receive. That's what really matters." As the night wound down and the glow of the fire cast a soft light over the room, James found himself filled with a deep sense of contentment. The world outside, with all its distractions, seemed so far away now. He had found what he had been searching for all along, true connection. And as the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, he realized that this was the greatest gift of all.